welcome to our webinar. We'll give people just a couple seconds to funnel in. So if you wanted to place in the chat who you are, where you're from, we'd love to know who is joining us here today. And today we have a very special webinar that I'm very excited about. This webinar is going to focus on solutions and human rights photojournalism. While we at Journalists for Human Rights have been bringing solutions journalism to journalists across Canada for over a year now, we noticed that there were not a lot of resources for visual journalists. So that is what led us to bring today these amazing, wonderful photographers together so that they can talk about this issue and give you some insights into how they capture solutions and human rights images. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator now, Jesse Winter, to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for letting me be part of this. I'm pretty excited for this conversation. I definitely think it's one that's very much needed, given the place that photojournalism is at in North America these days. Really quickly, I'm a photographer and reporter based in Vancouver. I work primarily around social justice, issues of the environment, government accountability. My work's appeared in the New York Times, Guardian, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and a few other places. Joining me today are three really amazing photographers whose work I very much admire. Kriston J. Bethel is a photographer based out of Philadelphia with a focus on documentary and editorial and portrait work that frequently connects the stories of ordinary people with national and global issues. His work's been commissioned by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, Patagonia, which I think is particularly cool, as well as publications and nonprofits and brands. Kriston's a member of Diversify Photo, a group of BIPOC and non-Western visual creators helping to diversify media outlets. He works frequently with Resolve Philly, a solutions-focused reporting collaborative based between newsrooms across Philadelphia that strives to uplift the voices of community in the region. In 2001, he was recognized with an award of excellence by Pictures of the Year International for work covering the 2020 US presidential election. And he was also featured in both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal's 2020 Year in Pictures. We also have Amber Bracken, who's a good friend of mine, a lifelong Albertan. Amber photographs primarily across Western North America to represent global issues in her own backyard. Her work explores intersections of race, environment, culture, and colonization. She specializes in invested relationships-based and historically contextualized storytelling that centers people in their own stories. Her recent work is focused on intergenerational trauma in Cree youth, the Wet'suwet'en reoccupation and land rights fights, overrepresentation of Indigenous people in homelessness, and interrogating the impact of race in her own family. Some of her select clients include the National Geographic, Globe and Mail, the Wall Street Journal, BuzzFeed, Maclean's, ESPN, the New York Times, and special recognition includes a World Press Photo Award, which she just won another of, so congratulations to her for that. It's really great to see, the Marty Forscher Fellowship, and an ICP Infinity Award. And finally, we will very shortly have Pat Kane, who's a photographer from Yellowknife. He's just wrapping up an assignment right now, so he'll be along very shortly. Pat takes a documentary approach to stories about people and life in Northern Canada, with a special focus on issues important to Indigenous people, including the relationship between land and identity. Pat's a National Geographic Society grantee, a Royal Canadian Geographic Society grantee, and an alumni of the World Press Photo Jupe Schwartz Masterclass, as well as a co-founding member and president of the Far North Photo Festival. He's a pretty busy guy. The Far North Photo Festival is a platform to help elevate the work of visual storytellers across the Arctic. He's a mentor with Room Up Front, which is a mentorship program for emerging BIPOC Canadian photojournalists. Pat identifies as a mixed Indigenous settler, as a proud member of the Algonquin member of the Temiskaming First Nation, and he's part of the photo collectives Indigenous Photograph and Boreal Collective. So thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, Jesse. That was great. You handled that.
Yeah, well done.
Thanks. Only a few rounds of practice. So as Kim has kind of set us up to talk about today, we're going to be looking at sort of how we can apply the tenets of solutions journalism to photojournalism and visual storytelling particularly. So I want to start off basically by just asking two of you what you think defines solutions photojournalism. And I think we should recognize that there might not be a perfect answer yet. So at the end of this whole thing, I think we should circle back. Maybe we can kind of think about this as trying to sort of winnow things down and arrive at like a nice, neat little definition. But Kriston, why don't we start with you? What does solutions photojournalism mean to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for the intro, Jesse, and for having us here today. I think the first thing that you need to look at is what is solutions journalism, right? And looking at focus on not just the issues and the problems, but what are people doing to help solve that? What are those successes? What are those failures? What are those challenges? And when you start from that point, you should strive to create imagery that really reflects that. A lot of the imagery that defines photojournalism traditionally is centered around, I would say, I don't want to say negativity, sounds too broad, but it could be centered around violence. It can be centered around poverty. And those are all deep issues that we need to cover and we need to, make people aware of. But when we're focusing on solutions, I think the imagery needs to be focused on that story and finding those solutions and seeing how they work. And again, looking at those through that lens.
Cool. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of the history of this industry tends. I think negativity is a fair word to use. I think we are really good at searching out problems and highlighting problems and sort of pointing people towards those things. Amber, what about you? What do you think solutions photojournalism means?
Well, I think Kriston's definition was pretty excellent, but for me, it like just functionally, like practically speaking, it's meant making more space for photographs. So not trying to tackle really difficult issues in a single photo, because if you're trying to talk about some kind of like major social problem and you're trying to condense that down into one photograph, that's where we fall into the trap of this, like, we turn the screws and to try and hype up and sensationalize what's already a really difficult and sensational problem. And I think that comes from a reasonably well-intentioned place, like we're trying to communicate how difficult it is. But when you have those kinds of images in isolation from humanizing or like other contextual elements, then it just reduces people to one thing. So yeah, practically speaking, I think we need to make space for difficult and complicated visual narratives so that we can have a range of representation of these difficult issues, that we can unpack them in more than one picture. I think that's helpful. And then sometimes, honestly, when there isn't time or space for a full photo essay on something, we can recognize that there's a canon of images that already exist. So like if we're talking about unhoused population, for instance, we do realize that it is a very difficult experience. We already know collectively from the canon of images that already exist on unhoused people, how dehumanizing and how ugly that can look. So if you have a short, if you have a shortness of space, like if you have to be brief with an image, then I think it would make sense to focus on what we don't know or the parts of the experience that are less represented, often defaults to me for humanization. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that what Amber shared about how it can really reduce people if you focus on just one image, reducing people to one thing. And I think that's an excellent point to make, because if we are trying to wrap people up into one neat little package and we're not being more encompassing, then we run the potential of doing more harm than good.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of those points. One of the things that's always kind of fascinated me about photography and photojournalism is that to some level we've and have always been kind of a technologically driven medium, like the technology of image making, from wet plates through to film to digital, and also the technology of presentation. And I think to some degree the old school instinct of the story in one photograph is perhaps a bit of a holdover from the days when like the only space was on the cover of the newspaper. And I think what's interesting to me to think about solutions photojournalism now in the digital space is that we can have a lot more space to tell more nuanced stories. I think convincing publications of that sometimes is a bit of a challenge, but I think those are really important things to hit on for sure. In order to do this work, in order to do a solutions-focused story, and feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but I think a big part of that work involves making sure that we've clearly identified the problem that this proposed solution or supposed solution is trying to solve. And I think that can sometimes be a bit of a fraught process, particularly when you're thinking about cliched imagery that already exists and how the problem's been previously defined. So when you're both setting out to tackle a story about a challenging issue, how do you go about making sure that the problem that is trying to be solved is well defined for the reader without relying on, you know, cliched depictions of, say, homelessness or incarcerated people? Amber, why don't we start with you first?
I try to let the community lead me into what the story should be. So if you're going through a solutions-based, like a solutions lens at photojournalism, there's always somebody working on making the situation better, whatever it is. And often there's amazing grassroots or like very connected to the community organizations that are doing that kind of work. And if you connect with people like that, they will take you to the problem, but they will also show you the solution and connect you to a much more nuanced representation of that, rather than you know, going like, again, I'm just gonna keep picking on this Unhoused because it's such a universal and kind of relatable example of an ongoing social problem that many places have a hard time solving. But like if you were trying to represent something like unhoused populations and you went out with police or enforcement type of lens, you're going to get a wildly different representation of who people actually are, versus if you go out with a network of grassroots people who are like, you know, working on mutual aid networks or housing issues, or if you go with people who are connecting to vulnerable groups like humanity, you will get to represent that humanity. If you go with people who are going from an enforcement or like a difficult adversarial relationship, then that's the experience that you'll get to represent. So I think you have to pay attention to who you're going with and what their view is. So letting people who are already doing solutions work lead you into the story, and you will automatically get there. And then the other thing is just to reiterate that having space. I don't personally think that it's wrong or bad to represent the most difficult parts of people's lives. I just think that we have to be very aware that when we don't have a lot of overlap in our experience with, like, let's say the experience of being unhoused, that we don't already know the like humanizing part of that story. So we have to work harder to make sure that we are connecting and properly contextualizing any like difficult or the more difficult parts of their life.
Yeah. I really don't have much to add on to that. I think that's excellent. I just think that, again, I think the issue that we have in journalism is with staff reductions and reductions in funding, that, you know, frankly, photographers and writers don't have that same level of time to spend with the community and in the community. And I think that's a really vital point, to be able to go out and speak with those people on the ground, rather than just at an organizational level, and not just reporting on them, but listening to them. And as Amber suggested, letting them guide you. You know, we still control the stories that we produce ultimately, but there's nothing wrong with making sure that you are being open to having people who are the experts really guide that coverage. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't verify and that you shouldn't do your research on your own. But I think really that the people on the ground who are experiencing whatever issue you might be covering, they're going to be your most valuable resource and will help guide your coverage.
Yeah, I think that's, I can't agree more with those perspectives as well. And I mean, Amber, I think you talk about sort of depictions of unhoused populations and stuff. And I see a lot of work. I do a lot of work in Vancouver's downtown east side, which is a community that's struggling with like a whole kind of colliding series of policy failures. And it often gets described in, whether it's in reporting or in photos, in these very reductionist terms, like it's the poorest poverty code or poorest postal code in Canada, things like that. And that's the framing that's always brought to those communities. And I think it can be really difficult sometimes. And I'm interested in both of your thoughts on, if you're working on an issue like that, where the public already has some really deeply ingrained ideas about what they think it looks like, what they think the problems are. And I think that extends to photo editors as well. Like there's an expectation that if I'm going to go out and photograph the toxic drug crisis in Vancouver, a lot of people bring a lot of baggage to what they think that should look like, and how much time it should take. And I'd be interested in how you two navigate that when dealing with an editor. Like, how do you advocate for more time, or for not including like the really cliched images that some editors might want? They might think they need it. Kriston, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think right off the bat, whenever I'm covering a topic with a sensitive issue, and I think a good practice for any story is to have a conversation with your editor and kind of understand what their expectations are, and have a conversation about what your expectations are, and discuss, straight up why you think a certain angle of coverage might be more detrimental and harmful than, regurgitating the same thing. When we talk about opioids and drug use, I know we see lots of images of needles and things along those lines, right? And that's a large issue in Philadelphia in particular as well. But I think, as Amber again said earlier, is going beyond that and thinking beyond that, and focusing on the humanity and finding other ways to show those stories can be just as impactful, right? And I think also from a visual perspective, if you're trying to create something that looks different, that stands out, why not do something different, right? I think that's a win for everybody. But I really think it's important to have conversations, understand your own convictions, and understand why the way that you want to show these stories is important, and just get that out there right off the bat and work with your editor. I've been thankful to work with lots of great editors. I hope everybody else does too. But a lot of editors I find are very understanding and are on the same board. And I think a lot more people are starting to think in terms of moving past some of these dated stereotypes and imagery, which is great to see. And so I hope, more photographers and more editors start exploring that as well.
Yeah, really great points. Amber, anything to add?
No, I think I've had good experiences with editors. I've had difficult experiences as well. I would say, just as like a general, bit of advice or comment on it, is to have really open conversations and make sure that you're like articulating your expectations for assignments, particularly when it's around a difficult thing. You'd be amazed at what just exists in sort of like people's subconscious if you don't address it. So having those conversations explicitly, that I don't intend to do the needle in the puddle photo, like that is not on my, we are absolutely focused on community building, and even though this is a story about people who are using drugs or whatever the case may be. So I think being explicit about it, and then it's a hard thing to do when you're like super green and new, but I've also gotten more and more comfortable with not giving people what they want if I feel like what they want is unethical. And I know that's a tall thing to ask for somebody who's new in the industry or just trying to like make your way. You really want your editors to like you, and I would say that that's like it's kind of like a last resort. I wouldn't like, hopefully I've had the good communication and we've been able to like have those conversations so that we know, and that I don't have to disappoint people. But if it comes down to my responsibility to a community or my responsibility to an outlet, I'm going to put the community first, especially if it's relationship based. Like, I mean, that's just such a valuable relationship to yeah. So anyways, those are my additional points.
one of the things that I'm hearing from both of you in talking about this specific issue kind of echoes back to what we said at the beginning about space and time. And I know in my own work, the situations where things have gone a little off the rails, or there's been an editor who's like, hey, this isn't what I expected. In every one of those cases, it's because there wasn't, I didn't make the time, or I didn't insist on there being the time to think about this properly. Like it was a breaking news assignment, or it was for a wire service that was like, hey, we need it right now. And it was just so fast that I think there's something about that you can just kind of slow down and be open and talk about this stuff. I think, yeah, that's a good way of, I've never had an editor insist on a stigmatizing photo when I had the chance to actually sit down and talk with them about it. It's only been when, like, you know, it's craziness and things are happening really fast. And also sort of thinking about time in my own work, especially in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, I've spent a lot of time not thinking just about what stories to tell, but when to tell them. And I think traditional journalism excels at pointing out problems, and then we kind of stop. We sort of say, look at this, the public needs to look at this, and if we make the public look at this, they will care and someone will find a solution, and then our job is done. And I think a lot of newsrooms also sometimes misunderstand solutions journalism as being only about looking uncritically at like confirmed successes. Like we wait for someone to have solved the problem, and then we say, look at this great thing, and here's a picture of the person who solved the problem. Kriston, I know in one of the pre-interviews you mentioned needing to stay for the whole story. Can you kind of interrogate that a bit for us? Elaborate what you mean by making sure that you're there for like the whole thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're saying about, looking at just the issue itself and not digging a little bit deeper into it. I think that's a great point to make, because one of the things that we experience, I think globally with news is just absolute news burnout, right? We have so much news and so much content that we are just fighting for attention and fighting for space, that people have a tendency to tune out. So I just wanted to kind of jump off of what you were initially saying, in that I think one of the benefits of solutions journalism, and that some outlets have found, that people are more likely to re-engage with these stories. Now, again, it's not about making fluff pieces, feel-good stories, right? It's still about looking critically. But as you said, I think when you look at the whole story, you're not focusing on just the problem, following it through, means trying to understand. And again, as you mentioned as well, with fast turnaround stories and quick deadlines, you don't always have that opportunity. So I think when you're talking about solutions journalism, you have to have the space and time possible to lead into that and to build off of that, so that you can see really what is being tried, and understanding that beyond just what problem is initially being looked at, if that makes sense. I feel like I went off a little bit. Hopefully I answered a little bit of that.
No, yeah, that was really helpful to hear. Amber, anything to add?
Well, my reflection on time, like how I think about time, is just like a general reimagining of how we think about what the role of photojournalism and photography is in news coverage and in reporting. So for a long time, historically, photo has been kind of a service industry for, the quote unquote real journalism of the writers. So you have kind of like a service department where somebody else does the reporting, and then you go and, quickly execute an image to illustrate what somebody else has reported. And I think we're expanding beyond that. Well, I know we're expanding beyond that. But in some ways, the practice doesn't change that much, where it is kind of like this quick service thing where we're responding to like if you're responding to assignments or news deadlines, where we're trying to do things quickly, and it's easier to fall into traps when that happens. And not to say that I think there's anything wrong with assignment work, but I know for myself, my work got infinitely better when I stopped being reactive as a freelancer and trying to like, oh, this is hot in the news, I better go do something on this, and really like rooted down in what do I actually care about? What do I have a sustained interest in? What can I educate myself in? What issues can I ground my understanding, so that I'm not trying to be so much a generalist as much as I'm trying to specialize and do less work, but do it really, really well. And in general, like we have such a saturated media market, I think that if we could really think of photojournalism as both a specialized practice, and that's like worth waiting for, that we have room to invest and allow people to do maybe less work overall, but really unique and good work that when a project comes out, it's like that is worth the wait. I think that shift could really do wonders for the kinds of journalism that we're seeing from photographers.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think keeping with this sort of theme of time for a minute, one of the things that I think can be really powerful about photojournalism in particular is finding a way to help tell stories kind of like in the between, like while someone who is currently tackling a problem, someone who's trying to solve it, and sort of following that process through. I mean, in some ways, there can be an easier way to sort of tell chronological or narrative stories in images, that as you sort of track the progress of something over time. At the same time, though, I think we generally in society, I think there's this strange kind of like phobia of failure and phobia of, actually, before I dive into that, let's say hi to Pat. Hey, Pat.
Hi, Pat.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
Sorry I'm late. I'm
no worries.
I was in jail. I was photographing something at the jail here. So.
Oh, crazy.
Yeah.
Did it go well?
Like,
good assignment?
It went great. Yeah, I was waiting for them to go outside to do something and waiting for a bunch of things to happen with inmates and officers is like way more complicated than just opening the door and going outside.
Totally. We've already kind of, there's been a sort of a theme through this conversation so far, which is kind of looking at time and space and waiting for stuff to happen and waiting for the good moment. So I'm not surprised to hear that. We're just sort of picking up from talking a little bit about sort of the role of time in storytelling. I asked these two most recently about sort of not just thinking about how to tell a story or what stories to tell, but when to tell them. At what point in the process or the narrative of a particular story is it right to start thinking about presenting that publicly? Can you talk a little bit about that in your work and how, like, do you grapple with that sort of stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hi, everyone. Thanks for waiting for me, by the way. I mean, a lot of my work is assignment work, right? So it's kind of like less dependent on me than what kind of publishers and editors kind of want to roll out with. But for personal projects, yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like, sensitivities and just being like ethical with your work. And, if something happens, like a lot of my work is around Indigenous communities, correct? So, with the unmarked graves that are being kind of dug up around the country, it's like, when is a good time to kind of show a community that may or may not have or has like some kind of impact or relationship to that, right? And it's really kind of dependent on the comfort levels of the people in those communities. So I really, I wouldn't have an exhibit on something because it's newsworthy, or it's like, it's happening now, so it's a good time to like put this out to the world. Usually that's kind of the opposite of how I work. You want to give space and make sure people have had a chance to grieve or to kind of think about it a little bit more, and then talk to people in the communities about like what would be an appropriate way to present this and timeline as well. So I think, yeah, just kind of being cognizant of, other people's relationship to the story, knowing that it's not really your story to begin with, right? So that's kind of how I work.
I also want to ask you quickly, since we kicked off this whole thing talking about sort of aiming for a definition of solutions photojournalism that maybe doesn't exist yet. And so we're going to come back to it at the end. Speaking broadly, what's your perspective on like what does solutions photojournalism mean to you in a broad sense?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually kind of not the first time I've heard of this kind of term, but like with this group, it's kind of like the first time it's really been put to me in like a formal kind of way. So I mean, a lot of it is just like kind of common sense and like, you know, kind of showing a story and photographing a story. You know, personally, I don't really photograph people who are homeless, who are struggling with mental illness in the moment, who are under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And that's just like a personal thing that I do. So, I mean, you know, how do you tell that story then of like things that are impacting people and why it's impacting people? I usually start with kind of the programs or the people that are leading the way to change those things as kind of my my framework. So I'm really going just kind of starting backwards, I guess, in a way, because you know, a lot of people would think, oh, I'm going to show like the impacts of, you know, this issue, whereas I'm trying to figure out what are the results and ways that people are moving forward from this issue, and then kind of move backwards. And then if there are people that want to talk to me who have been impacted by things, I can do a portrait session with them, or I can like hang out with them wherever they are, you know, based on their comfort level and what they're willing to share with me as well. And yeah, it kind of works better that way for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. You hit on something that I also spend a lot of time thinking about, particularly out here in Vancouver, that there's this, I think for a long time in photojournalism, there's been this sort of belief that if we depict the consequences of public policy failure, our job's done. Like that's what we've done. We've shown everybody the outcome of these really complicated, often really like nuanced systems that are breaking down and failing, but in complicated ways. And I'm really interested in everyone's thoughts on how to depict, or at least how to make sure that your representation doesn't sort of put too much of a moralizing lens on the people who are ultimately sort of struggling within policy failures. Like their place in the world is not always entirely up to them in some cases, given the systems that they're dealing with. So maybe Amber, can you speak a little bit about how you sort of manage that space?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question that I don't have an easy always or never black and white kind of rule. I would say generally, though, it starts with listening and trying to connect with the community, trying to absorb as much of their experience as you can to understand what's important to them, first of all, and checking in with them about these kinds of questions of representation. So pain and suffering are part of the human experience. I really don't accept that it's always dehumanizing that somebody's pain and suffering is depicted. What can be dehumanizing is if a community only has their pain and suffering depicted, and we only have those pictures and that representation of them. But I learned pretty early in my career, I had a lesson about checking in with people about those kinds of questions, about how they wanted to be represented. There was a story that I worked on as part of a campaign to represent the experiences of cancer survivors or people who've been through cancer. And it was a really upbeat campaign, and I picked up the tempo from it. So we ended up doing this portrait with a cape, and it was like very triumphant. Like it was very like, you know, we beat cancer's butt kind of vibe to it. And I remember talking to the survivor afterwards, and he didn't get mad at me, but he was like, that isn't really my feeling of it, you know, like he told me that he felt that there was a lot of pain in between that wasn't acknowledged, that wasn't validated. And so I think that we have to pay attention to what communities want, what people want, and not to say that we should just be serving their desires like at their beck and call, but I think we need to listen to what is the experience, what's important to it what's important about the experience of the people who are actually living it, and then pay attention to that representation. So for me, it's about listening, it's about agency, it's about checking into with the community and what matters to them. And that's sort of like how I can navigate the sometimes, sometimes pain and suffering is worth representing, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes we really do want to focus on those heroic moments of strength and accomplishment.
Yeah. Kriston, Pat, anything to add to that?
Not really all that much. I think that was really fantastic. And again, it's a topic that I think we're coming back to again, is just this idea that if we are trying to make honest representations of communities and the issues they face, we have to be willing to look at those communities as a whole, which again, as we've said, can be difficult in trying to surmise in one image or in one story, especially with limited resources, limited, budget for space in print. But if we take the time to expand on that, then I think we do a much better job of telling more honest stories as well, too.
Something that I want to pick up on that Amber mentioned is the idea of agency and making sure that the people we're photographing have agency in terms of how they're depicted. Kriston, you and Pat both have worked with incarcerated people, and that's a situation where almost all of their agency has been taken away in some cases. How do you navigate making sure that people feel respected, feel given agency to participate in a photo story or a photo essay, given a situation like that? Maybe I'll start with you, Kriston, and then hear from Pat.
Yeah. And even beyond, I think working with, incarcerated persons, that's, I think, the highest form of a lack of agency, right? There is little more that you can have taken away from you. And so I think if you work from that and any other populations, first important to recognize, I think, in any story you're covering, where might that agency be lacking? Where might that freedom be lacking? And identifying that first. And I think, again, it's important to, as much as I said it was important to have conversations with editors, you want to have conversations with the people that you are photographing and working with and talking, because you're the shepherd of their story. And I think the last thing that any of us wants to do is misrepresent someone. So having those conversations, understanding their perspective, and trying to be respectful of them as another human being first, rather than just the subject of a story. I think you build better relations with your contacts that way. I think people will respect you more and will have the opportunity to open up to you more if you have that conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who have had different experiences, I'll say differing experiences with journalists, and they have a certain perception about what we do and what we're like, and just showing the smallest bit of humanity to somebody and recognizing that they're a person first goes such a long way in building that trust, which is something you need to have if you are trying to report on people who are experiencing trauma or experiencing difficulties in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Pat, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, Kriston, I think, nailed it, how it should be and what the realities are. I mean, I don't have a ton of experience photographing incarcerated people, really, like just a few times and just right now, actually. So my experience might be a little bit different because, it's actually just way more formal than you might imagine. Like I'd go through like some paperwork, and the Department of Justice kind of insisted that I didn't photograph people's faces. So I kind of had all these parameters laid out around me already. But one interesting thing is, like, when they see me with my camera in a prison, usually they're like, take my picture, take my photo, like, I want to be part of this. And they kind of have to go through their permissions, and it's like kind of complicated. And I actually think that is more of an issue of agency of someone who wants their photo taken, than me taking their photo, because, you know, it's like, these are grown men. Like, what if they want to be in a magazine or a newspaper? Like, it's totally their right. But you have the government and the Department of Justice and the jail itself saying, no, 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 we're not going to let you do that, and kind of treating you like a little kid. And I don't even know why. I think, like, is it because they don't want the jail to be shown, or who's in there? Like, is it like that PR? I really don't even understand why they wouldn't allow that. But anyway, I just play ball with the rules, and they're kind of like, the inmates that I worked with today are kind of like part of a broader story that I'm telling. So, you know, I just tell them why you're there, what you're doing, where the images are going to appear. Say, like, I'll share it with you guys after, kind of thing. But yeah, so my experience is kind of like pretty surface level on that, but definitely issues of agency around that, and communities as well everywhere. So.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's something that I've run into in Vancouver as well. The way that sort of like Vancouver and British Columbia officialdom tends to take agency away from people. And it's like the more compounded your struggles in, or a person's struggles in whatever system is failing them, the more compounded those struggles are, the more likely it is that the system is not going to is going to deny them agency to be part of a photo essay. Like, we can't, getting access to places like supervised drug consumption sites or modular housing. I often have the same experience where people, they want their stories told, they want to be represented carefully and respectfully and as whole people, but it's like, yeah, it's government agencies that get in the way of that. I'm conscious of time, so let's move to sort of the case study part of this. I think each of you has a photo project that they brought and can share with the group. Why don't we start? Amber, are you cool to kick things off?
Sure. Sure.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, just sort of show us some pictures and tell us a little bit about the project.
Right. So this is a story that I worked on in Inukjuak in northern Quebec, the Inuit speaking portion of northern Quebec. And I came to this story because I was basically like researching like reclamation of birth practices for Indigenous communities. And there's an upswing of intention for people to, you know, have Indigenous midwives and to return birth to communities and have cultural practices. And I found multiple studies about these Inuit midwives who had in the 1980s insisted that they be allowed to go back to their bring birth back, because prior to the 1980s, every baby that was born in the community was actually not born in the community. They were evacuated to places like Montreal or Ontario and places in the South. So, you know, literally thousands of miles from their family and their community. Often in places where they didn't speak the language, when they were subject to like extreme kinds of racism. And it was just, I mean, so lonely. If you've ever had a baby, or if you've ever known somebody who's had a baby, those last weeks of pregnancy can be some of the most difficult. And that's when you need your support around you the most. And this evacuation policy had women leaving their communities up to 6 or 8 weeks ahead of their birth date, because flights can be unpredictable in the north. So in the 1980s, the elders and the grandmas, they said, you know what, that's enough. We used to have birth here. We're going to have birth again. And more or less just told the government that this is how it was going to be, and insisted. And what I love about this program and about these women is it's been wildly successful. So just in the final years of the evacuation policy, where just about all babies were born in the South, the infant mortality and maternal mortality rates were 3 times as much as they were during a comparable period in the South. So comparing it to Montreal, today, there's still a slightly elevated infant mortality. I think it's like 7.7 to 5.3, but it's been wildly successful in having amazing health outcomes, and then also these cultural and community outcomes where, you know, there's something to celebrate in the community, like having a baby surrounded by your loved ones and getting to celebrate with the people who it impacts the most is just a beautiful thing. And it's a simple thing, but also a foundational, important part of just being a human. So I came to this story because they were so good at it, you know, because they had so much success, and was able to spend time helping to share that story. And I felt really strongly about representing this success story because, I mean, it's proven for, I mean, decades now. Like I said, this program started in the 1980s, but it also is potentially a model for other communities. So there's lots of places in the North where there still is a lot of evacuation, or they have more of a doctor model. So part of this midwifery program is that they're Inuit midwives who have ties to their community, and can have like all this shared cultural understanding, compared to having this rotation of like doctors and nurses from Ontario, from Montreal coming in. So I think it's fun to celebrate, but I also think it's potentially a really effective model for other communities that would want to pursue some kind of similar reclamation of their birth practices.
Wow, that's a really powerful piece of work. Can you talk just for a second about what the pitching process was like when you obviously researched and found this story. How did you get the publication interested? How did you frame it in terms of getting the assignment?
I think more or less how I've explained it here. So I strongly highlighted the fact that that it was a success story. I think I led with that from the beginning, that this was an amazing success story that was sort of situated in this other bigger problem, I suppose. So there's an ongoing issue of infant and maternal mortality for birth in the North. And I mean, some of it's structural because of like generations of colonization, and some of it's just like a practical reality of things are more difficult in the North. And if you have complications, then you have to hopefully get a flight. So anyways, I framed it as a success story within this larger context of difficulty. And I had already had some of the contacts, and I had done lots of the research. So this one was actually kind of easy to get picked up. People were excited about it. So yeah.
Awesome. That's very cool to hear. Where was it published?
In New York Times.
Nice. Kriston, why don't you go next and give us a look at one of the projects you've worked on?
Yeah, absolutely. This story is also related to women in birth, incidentally. This was about a program called the Mom Mobile program that takes place in Philadelphia at the Riverside Correctional Facility. This story actually came to me from Next City, which does a lot of different reporting across the country. And it's looking at this program that helps women who have recently had children stay connected to their children through a breast milk pumping program. So what the program does is they have a cell space set up inside the jail, and they're allowed to pump, and that milk is then frozen and then transported to their child's caregivers. Sometimes it's a family member, sometimes somebody else is watching them during their time, and that allows them to maintain that connection. The big thing for me, again, when we're talking about solutions journalism, and if we could hold on this image for a second, in solutions journalism is, again, focusing not on the problem, but the solution, right? So in this issue, we have women who have children who are separated from them because they are currently incarcerated. That is an issue that needs to be acknowledged. The woman on the far left, Sierra, she spoke to myself and the writer that we were working with. She knew that there had been a warrant for her arrest, and she went into labor knowing this. and the police were notified while she was in the hospital, and she had the typical 2-week stay, or sorry, 2-day stay in the hospital, after which she was separated and she went to jail. So she had 2 days with her child before she was separated. That is an issue, but the question becomes, what is the solution to help keep them connected? And for this story, I had wanted to try my best to show these women as not just being inmates, but to really try to capture more of who they are. And so I had a conversation with them. First I had a conversation with Kelly over in Next City and said up front, I'd like to do portraits of these women that go a little bit beyond just the stereotype. And then when I was there, had some additional conversations beforehand. But it wasn't just me alone with them. There was myself, there was a writer, there was a representative from the I believe both from the jail itself and also from the prison system, and then 2 other women from the Mom Mobile program. So that's kind of like a full room to have people witness you having your photo taken, and just had a quiet conversation with them, making sure that they felt comfortable having their photo taken, and tried to work with them, as much as possible to capture them. And we can keep moving forward with the images too. But what was really great about this program is that it's not just a service in the sense that it is just them providing breast milk to their children. They have photos that come back to these women while they're incarcerated. The women from the Mom Mobile program get to know these families and bring stories back to them. So it really does maintain this connection between mother and child. They also do educational resources as well in helping them learn how to be better parents. And so when we talk about solutions journalism, I think it's really important to look at what is being done differently, and it's taking that different perspective on things. And so after going to the prison, or going to the jail rather, I thought it was important to kind of follow through on that and also see how this works on the other end. And I should note too that this wasn't a long-term story. This was definitely a short term, only a couple of days. But I asked if we could spend that extra time, which again, so if we talked earlier about what happens when you have an assignment that is only 1 day, I think you have a conversation with your editor and you say, you know what, I think there's a little bit more to this that we should see. And I thought it was really important that we saw, this delivery and this connection to children themselves. And so this is Teresa, who is Sierra's aunt, who's taking care of her daughter, Sierra's daughter, Umaya, who's only 5 months old at this time. And it's just, there's a lot of work that goes into keeping these families together. And there are so many issues related to incarceration and returning citizens when they are released. How do we maintain families? How do we help people improve their lives? And I think it's that aspirational idea about what criminal justice can be, and looking beyond just a lot of the issues that plague the system, and give people an idea about what we could actually work for.
Amazing. What can you talk a little bit about sort of, you said that you spent time making sure to have like quiet conversations with these individual women just to make sure that they weren't feeling maybe too overwhelmed with a room full of people or too pressured into participating, that they were comfortable. How did they feel about being part of a story like this and about the way that you wanted to help tell this story? What were they like, yeah, okay, I'll go along with this? How did they feel about being presented like this?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me first start by saying too that I reached out to Akana Zamaria, who's over at Vox, and I kind of just wanted to have a conversation with her about how to approach this as well. And I think anything that any photographer or journalist should do is have an understanding of the privilege that they carry with them when they're reporting on any community, especially if it's a community outside of their own. In this case, we're talking about an incarcerated population, and that difference between having freedom and not having freedom. This is also a women's correctional facility. So I am a man going to a women's correctional facility, which also carries its own sense of privilege in it. And being a journalist and a photographer, we all carry a certain level of control because, as I said earlier, we're all creating these stories as we see fit. And ultimately, we're the ones that make those decisions, in as well as with editors and designers and all that whole process. But ultimately, the people that we're reporting on don't get that same level of participation in the process. So when we talked about having this conversation, when I spoke with Kainas about this, about speaking with these women and kind of understanding that they weren't feeling pressured in any way to participate, either from a program perspective or from the jail as well. And to answer your question, they all wanted their stories told. Kind of like what Pat was saying before, a lot of people do want their stories to be told. And they were excited. They saw this program as being a positive. They saw it as something that was affecting their lives in a positive way. And all of them were absolutely on board with sharing their stories.
That's really, really good to hear, and connects with something I was actually that I've been thinking a lot about lately. I was actually in a workshop just yesterday that was all about trauma-informed practice and how to not only protect yourself, but by protecting yourself, protecting your subjects. And one of the things that the trainer was talking about is that as journalists, we do carry a lot of power, and sometimes that power can be really healing, like allowing a vehicle for people to have their story told in a way that highlights their agency and their humanity and their complexity can for people who've experienced trauma, can sometimes be a really healing thing if we do it properly and carefully and in recognition of the privilege that we carry when we do it. So thanks a lot for presenting this. I think it's beautiful work.
Yeah.
Pat, do you want to show us a project that you've been working on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, guys. Those are amazing, amazing projects, and yeah, just really important as well. Should I share my screen or? Okay, there we go. Perfect. So this, I'm showing a project that I did for World Press Photo. They have an education program called the Jupe Swart Masterclass. And what they do is they ask people who are in the program to do either a personal project or a self-assigned story around a topic that is like hits close to home or like where they live, or it could be a really personal project as well. So for that project or that program, I decided to do kind of a different story than what I usually do. This is outside of my assignment work. This is kind of like a hybrid between a personal project and kind of more documentary style work, and it's a little more nuanced and not in your face is what I normally would do for assignment work. But it's a story about colonization, which is like a huge topic. How do you tell that story? So I wanted to tell it through the people in the Northwest Territories where I live, and kind of, we're talking about results, or sorry, moving ahead and like results-based journalism and all of these issues. So this is my attempt to show how the people here in the Northwest Territories are kind of reclaiming their identity, their voice, their culture, their languages in a more of a nuanced kind of way. So it's not kind of hitting you over the head with action shots or anything like that. So a lot of the work that I put into this was kind of showing symbols of colonization that are still all over the Northwest Territories and all over Canada, but it's pretty stark here in the Northwest Territories just because communities are so small, and you'll always see like a church in town. And like in this picture here, for example, it's always the tallest building. It has like a big spire with a cross. Anywhere you go, that's kind of like you're walking into a colonized community. And I kind of wanted to show symbols of colonization without showing, the impacts of colonization, which would be homelessness, substance abuse in a lot of cases, you know, all sorts of things that I think in the media we see all the time, and it doesn't really tell a good story. And in many ways, it kind of harms communities and stereotypes and tropes, right? So I wanted to show symbols of colonization, but also like feature the people that are doing something to make their lives a little bit, to change their lives and to like move forward in reconnecting with their language, the land. There are a lot of people who do like moose hide tanning. There are people who are changing their names back to their traditional names. You know, people are going into guardian programs and stewardship programs here in the Northwest Territories. So I kind of wanted to feature like, what are people doing to change this like big idea of colonization, and you know, moving forward without knowing that that's never really going to change anything, but just acknowledging that you have a place here, you know, your traditions and languages and culture is valued, and here's kind of what it looks like. So in a lot of these pictures, you'll see it's like a lot of still life. There are some portraits here and there. And I kind of did that on purpose, and I wanted it to be a quieter kind of project. Does it succeed? I'm not too sure, but I know that I'm proud of the work that I did, just because it like kind of took me personally out of my comfort zone, but also the people that I photographed and talked to afterwards have been kind of really moved by it as well, because it's kind of unexpected. It's like not what people would see when they tell a story about colonization and Indigenous communities in Canada.
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting. You described this project. I knew it was for the Jube Short Masterclass. I didn't know that part of their ask was that you tackle something that's kind of close to home. I mean, there's this idea in photojournalism that I think we've probably all heard, that I'm not exactly sure. It's debated which photographer allegedly said this first, but the idea that if your photographs are not good enough, you're not close enough. And I think that can be a useful thing sometimes. Sometimes it can be a problematic thing if we're not careful about our own positionality when we think about that. But one thing that we haven't really talked a lot about in this webinar yet is the issue of access and trust building and gaining the trust and confidence to show people in ways that feel honest. And I think one of the things that speaks to me the most about this project is just how comfortable and honest everyone who's depicted. It feels very real for that reason. Can you talk a little bit about your practice in terms of access and community and trust building?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think for me, I've been here a long time. Like I live in Yellowknife. I've been here for almost 20 years now, and I've traveled extensively around the Northwest Territories and Nunavut as well. And well, Jesse, like when you live in Yellowknife and everyone knows someone in another community or is related to someone in another community. So like getting to know people in a space that's like huge is actually kind of easy, because people are actually closer in relation to each other than you'd expect. So I mean, just because I've been here for so long and people know my work or have seen me around with my camera, I think that alone makes it a lot easier for people to welcome me. But I'm also cognizant that I'm not just going to walk into a community and expect them to know who I am and what I'm doing. So I mean, really just like explaining to people what you're working on, how you want to photograph someone. And then also with a project like this, I got people to they're like, do you want me to dress a certain way or like be in a certain pose? I'm like, no, just be yourself, come as you are. And for a lot of these, I actually got the people that I photographed to write captions. And I'm starting to do that a little bit more, where I'm getting kind of more feedback on what I'm writing about them, because you know, the photographs are half of the story. I feel like captions really bring it home. And I think that's a really good way to, like, we talk about collaboration all the time, but what does that really look like? I think that that is a very tangible way to collaborate with someone, is like, let's sit down and let's write a caption for this photo that I'd like to be part of that project. And usually I'll get them to like literally write it out and kind of teach caption writing while I'm at it. And then at the end, we edit it together, and it's like a really nice, they're happy with how they're being represented, what is being said about them. And I'm happy that it kind of conveys the message and the information that is also necessary with it. And I mean, a lot of people always ask me this, like, how do you get access? How do you get access? Indigenous communities and Indigenous people, I've never had a problem with being welcomed. They're so welcoming, and they want people to visit their communities and see what their life is like. They're very proud of that. I mean, so going in and just being a nice, normal human being is like, you know, that's 90% of it. But if you go into a community and you're awkward, and you like don't shake people's hands, and you don't try their food, I mean, yeah, that's one way that people are going to be like, who is this person? Like, why are they here? So, I mean, a lot of it is just common sense and being a nice person and being open to people's ideas and culture. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'm really interested in your practice of having, like, collaboratively writing captions, or having people basically giving them the agency to decide on the caption information that goes with the photo. That's not actually a practice I've heard of before, and I think it's super interesting. And it also speaks to something else that we've sort of mentioned it obliquely a few times in this workshop so far, but the idea of accountability to the people that you're photographing. Can you just talk a little bit about what, like, are people surprised when you ask them, hey, like, I want you to be part of this caption writing process? Like, what's their response when you offer that to the folks in these photographs?
So far, people have been like really kind of excited about that aspect of it, because it's like they feel like they are part of this process of like what the photos look like and what is going to be kind of put out there, and how they're represented. So I mean, it's been all good so far, and I just need to also be kind of like cognizant of the fact that I need to like be objective as well at the same time in a lot of instances. But I mean, you know, caption writing kind of has a format or a formula to it, where you're kind of like, you know, the who, what, where's, and then like the why, and then like usually a quote I'll put in from the person I'm photographing. And so like that quote kind of process is like where we really kind of like think about what we're talking about, because like a lot of the times you'll go in and you'll be like, you're trying to get like a very philosophical kind of like message across to the audience who will be reading this. But to like people in everyday Indigenous communities, they're not thinking about like colonization 24/7. So you kind of like have to like say, you know, I'm doing this project about this, and how you and your moose hide tanning, for example, is really kind of moving things forward, and like you're reclaiming identity. And then they'll explain to me what is, you know, what they're really doing and why it's important, and the process. And like I'm learning, getting information as well. And so like, can we like sit down and like just write out like a caption for your photos that would you know, explain a little bit better than I could, but it would also have your voice in it too. And yeah, that totally, you know, they love it. It makes it great. And I feel like I'm offloading my work on them sometimes, but it's like they really do appreciate it. And so far so good. No one's really gotten upset or anything like that yet.
Interesting. That's fascinating. I'd love to chat, pick your brain a bit more sometime about that whole process. Conscious of our time, we're running a tiny bit over here. So I think let's try and move to the Q&A session now. Where did the chat window go? Okay, so I've got some questions in the chat here. I'm just going to, in no particular order, just start kind of tackling them one at a time. I'll pose them, and then the three of you can answer as you would like. So the first question here, I would like to take photos at protests and rallies, but can never find out about them beforehand. How do you go about finding that information? That's a super interesting question, and I think one that we can all speak to. I'd like to append an element to that, which is to maybe also get, if you could respond a bit about where you find stories and how you approach those sorts of things. So I don't know who wants to tackle that one first. Amber.
Sure. I would say that generally, what's the goal? Is the goal to photograph rallies in general? Are you trying to photograph, visual representation of social organization, or is it a particular issue that you're organizing around? So I would, if it's the latter, if it's a particular issue, the way to find any demonstrations or rallies on that issue is to connect with people who are organizing around that issue. So, find out who's doing work on whatever the issue is that you want to represent, and connect to them and make it clear that you want to come along, and ask them to notify you, but also check in with them periodically. Say, how you doing? What's coming up? Is there anything in the works that I should be aware of? Like, what are you doing Saturday? Just check on people and nurture those relationships. And I think that that's the same advice if you were, for instance, trying to photograph more of a generalized representation of protest culture or something like that. You would do the same thing. You would just have to do it with more communities and find out who's organizing around different issues. And maybe beyond that, pay attention to your Facebook events, and just pay attention to what's happening, read the news, check your socials, and be prepared to connect. But
yeah, I think, Facebook and social media, a lot of times protests will be posted there in advance. But then, like Amber said, you can work backwards from there. And I think it's worthwhile to reach out to those organizers, to talk to them and gain a better understanding about what they're protesting and why. For me, it's not always just enough to see just that the protest itself is happening. But if you want to go beyond that, to really speak to people and connect on a deeper level about what the issue is that is being protested, or why people are rallying, I think that's an important step.
Pat, anything to add?
No, not really. I don't photograph protests or rallies at all, really. So, yeah, keep on top of social media for sure, but depends where you live. And also, ask yourself, why are you photographing a protest, and why aren't you photographing the issue around the protest? Is kind of how I would tackle it, because I think there's more compelling, kind of longer term stories that would be valuable, and images that would be valuable if we think about, not getting the action shot, but the impact shot, and the people around a cause and a movement is just more interesting, I find. For me anyway, it's just a personal thing.
Yeah, interesting. I think those are all really good answers. Moving on, so the next question: photojournalism is very human focused, but one of solution journalism's imposters is the idea of hero worship, and we need to make sure that we're not elevating a single person as the savior of a problem. What do photographers need to do to avoid slipping into the sort of visual hero worship in how they depict people and a proposed solution? Super fascinating question. I'm really interested to hear. Kriston, why don't you tackle this one first?
Yeah, I think we might have touched on this just a little bit earlier, with the idea of when we're photographing stories and working on stories, you don't want to look at just the organizational level. You need to get down to the community level and speak with people that are being impacted by the issues that you're reporting on. It's really important to have their voices, to see their faces, to understand their perspective. And so if you are digging in a little bit deeper to that layer beneath that, I think that goes a long way into making sure that you're being solutions focused. And like we said earlier, not just feature stories on individuals or particular organizations.
Yeah, I think that's really, really sharp insights. Pat, anything you want to respond to on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is really tough questions. This is like way more academic than my brain can handle, but let me try. I mean, yeah, I mean, what is problematic? Like, you know, white men putting that kind of like angle on this kind of hero, white saviorism thing is like problematic. Always has been, is only kind of now being talked about. On the other side, you know, I work with Indigenous communities a lot. I'm trying my best to not also prop Indigenous people and like elders and leaders as kind of like the spokesperson for stories and like as like the role model, because, you know, these people usually aren't asking to kind of be like the savior or like the hero of this story or a cause or movement or whatever. They're simply part of it. So I really have to walk a fine line between, am I kind of over glamorizing this, or am I kind of like also, you know, acknowledging that there are people and situations that are not great in Indigenous communities. And so, yeah, there's a fine line between telling a truthful story and making a minority or like a BIPOC community or person kind of put them way up on a pedestal with a lot of expectations that, you know, could be hard to manage or hard to talk about, or maybe they just don't want to be that the face of something. So, I mean, being cognizant of that is really important. I don't know if I always succeed in that, but I'm definitely thinking about that, and I'd like to be better at doing that.
Amber, thoughts?
I don't know if I have like specific like practical applications for how to avoid it in a particular instance, but I'd say in my work, and I would hope like as a culture that we can in general move away from hero worship and also like demonization of specific people. I think we would all be in a much better place if we could embrace complexity and embrace nuance and a range of human qualities and traits in any given person or population. Like we do that a lot, and I feel like that's something that happens in photojournalism specifically, in visual journalism specifically, where we're trying to, I don't know, condense people down to one or two traits. And I personally am much more interested in the like expansive, complex braiding of human experience that exists in all of us. You know, all of your heroes have flaws, and you know, all of your enemies have virtues. So I think that there's something in connecting to that and really embracing the complexity, and so not sidestepping things that are inconvenient for the particular narrative. You know, somebody can be a hero within their community, you know, and also have enemies and people that are critical of them, and they can be imperfect. And, you know, I think that if we are open to that complexity, we would all generally be so much farther ahead.
Yeah, I think those are really, really insightful points. And it connects to something too that I've heard talked about in a solutions journalism space, which is the idea of like remembering that it's to some degree our job to complicate the narrative. Journalism is really good at finding simple narratives or reducing stories to simple narratives of good guy, bad guy, problem, solution, and remembering that reality is complex. Like nothing is as clear cut as we want it to be in an 800-word news story with 5 photos or whatever. But I think that's really good advice. Open-ended question here. What are the other challenges of a solutions visual journalism approach compared to other projects that you've worked on? Acknowledging that we don't always do solutions journalism necessarily, although maybe it's fair to say that we can apply a solutions journalism lens to most of our work. But is there anything particular about trying to do this work that is more challenging than sort of your daily assignment work, let's say? Amber, why don't you tackle that one first?
I'm not 100% sure I understand. So like, would it be like comparing the difficulties of specifically solutions journalism to other types of journalism?
I guess maybe if I could attempt to interpret the question, I'm curious about if there's anything you think that makes solutions journalism more difficult than sort of regular journalism, I guess, regular photojournalism.
Oh, okay. Sure. I think it's time. I think we already covered that at the beginning. It's time and it's investment, and it's embracing the complexity of it. So compared to, say, a one-off assignment, I might meet somebody for an hour or two, and it is just like inherently less complex, and it's you don't find out all of the things that are complicating the narrative because you're just not there long enough. And there's a time and a place for that. I'm like, I don't think every story has to be, a full-on documentary or like a deep dive. But yeah, it's kind of like the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, or the more uncertainty there is about what you should know and what's worth sharing. So I think you're wading into a bigger problem. I think it's worthwhile. I think that's a worthwhile problem to have. But yeah, I would say the biggest difference is time. And I'm not sure if this is the place, but I also just wanted to highlight that this conversation we have talked has been heavily focused on the ethics and complexities and nuances of photographing in vulnerable communities. But I also wanted to point out that like solutions journalism can also look to perpetrators, and can also look to like the origin of the problem. So there's a time and a place for being really sensitive and really careful with representation and agency and thinking about power dynamics. There's also a time and a place for an absolutely iron backbone, and flexing every single right that we have as journalists, and doing the whole speaking truth to power and being brave about representing harms in the community, or like basically chasing down perpetrators. So that's like kind of a whole nother can of worms, and it's a little bit harder to unpack here, but I just want to say that solutions journalism doesn't always have to look at people who are suffering the consequences of harm, that we can look to perpetrators as well.
Thanks for flagging that. I think that is a really good point. It's definitely a very complicated question, probably deserves its own webinar. But I think in terms of your mentioning of issues of things like press freedoms and rights, when we're talking about harms, in a lot of cases, we're talking about systemic harm, failing public systems that are failing, social systems that are failing people, and those have causes. And I think we can remember, and feel free to correct me if anyone thinks I'm wrong, but particularly in looking at sort of things like police behavior and police misconduct, police brutality, I don't think anybody would argue that we have to give state systems or organizations like that quite the same level of, I don't want to say agency, but we do need to insist on our rights and our ability to tell honest stories, particularly when organizations like the state are trying to restrict our abilities to do that. I think that's really important. Does anyone want to respond to either the original question or this issue that Amber's raised?
Well, sorry, I'll get out of the way in a second, but I just wanted to say that exactly that we don't have the same, that basically we have to understand our responsibilities as photojournalists and as documentarians as existing on a spectrum that is directly proportional to the amount of power of the people that we're photographing. So for instance, Pat's practice of including communities in caption writing practices, I don't think anybody would argue that that is recommended or useful in terms of interacting with like governments or a police presence. Like we don't necessarily want them to be able to frame the issue when they already hold so much of the power in the relationship, and that it's a different practice when we're talking about people who are historically and systemically disempowered, and their worldview is not given the same credence. So I just think that there's a nuance there about the kind of like the when and the how this like agency and delicacy is executed.
Yeah, any responses to that?
No, I think that was wonderful.
Awesome. Last question in the dying minutes. Hopefully we can get through this quickly. So Thomas from Nairobi, Kibera in Kenya has asked a couple questions. One which I'm particularly interested. I think there's a nuanced answer to it. But his first question is, how many photos can be used in a photo story? Pretty open-ended. So what would you say are sort of the parameters of that? Recognizing the difference between like a short photo story for a news assignment versus say like a years long project. Pat, why don't you start there first?
I don't know if I know how to answer that, because it kind of just depends on many things. The publication, the kind of story, like within a publication, you know, is it a hard news event? Is it kind of a feature story? And yeah, how long you're working on it too. Is it have you been working on it for a year, 2 years, 5 minutes? Like, it really depends. But I mean, as a general rule, when I'm editing, and that's kind of where I start, is like I will edit, you know, a tight edit for me would be, you know, 20 photos. And that's like actually kind of a wide edit as well. But I mean, start at 20, and then, you know, depending on what the publication is or where it's going to be seen, then the editors will edit it down or maybe ask for more. I'm not too sure. But yeah, I kind of start at 20 and then work backwards from there. I don't know if that answers the question really, but.
Any other thoughts on how to edit?
Unless
recognizing that, like, I do not know the answer to this question. I struggle with it all the time, honestly.
Unless Kriston wants to jump in, I have kind of like a framework that I could use.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is just it depends. You know, I think Pat already alluded to this. It depends on the story that you're working on too, and I can't remember which of us said it previously, but not every story needs to be a full photo essay, right? It depends on. I think everything that you do as a journalist, as a photojournalist, it's in service to the story that you're trying to tell. And some stories are a little bit shorter and they might require 5 images, right? And some stories are a little bit longer and you have a little bit more space and it can be 12 to 15. Sometimes if you have a lot that you're trying to tackle, maybe it is 20 or 30 or something like that. I would consider that to be, I think most publications would see that as a wide edit. But again, if you're telling different aspects of the story, editing is just such a complex thing, right? Which is why we have editors working with us to shape that story. It's the same as if you were to write a story, right? You don't need to write down every quote that you heard, and you might not even include every person that you interviewed, but you need to craft the story that is going to engage people and do that story justice. But yeah, Amber, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
As Thomas points out, as everyone's pointed out, it's a variety of different ways to edit any given story. I would say that in deciding how many pictures are going to be included, that you should check in with the application. So the same story, for instance, could have a 5-picture edit, a 12-picture edit, a 22-picture edit, and then like a book edit, if it's like a long-term project. But the short answer is as many photos as are great. And I like to think of editing as almost like a carving example, like a carving exercise. So you start out with sort of like a lump of clay, which would be the like mass of all of the photos that you have. And then you're whittling away to kind of reveal what the story is. And so in a sense, your best edit is always going to be the smallest edit. So it's like, you've really distilled down the best of the best of the best of the best and been really brutal about making those cuts. And so you've got a very sharp and clear form of your story. So I would say as many are as good, the least possible, and also depending on the application of where you're going to publish it or where the story's going.
Yeah, all awesome pieces of advice that I will certainly take to heart. An acknowledgement, I'm an absolute terrible editor of my own work. I end up being like way overly committed to photos that are not very good, and then I miss photos that might be okay in an edit. So one of the best pieces of advice I've ever had is find an editor you trust who can be a bit of a mentor, somebody who, whether it's another photographer, a professional editor at another publication, somebody who's good at editing photo stories and can give you constructive and honest feedback. You don't want somebody who's just going to say, oh, these are all beautiful. Like, you want somebody who's going to say, nah, this doesn't work, that one doesn't really work, and here's why. That's something that I think is super important.
Jesse, just to touch on that too, is like, you know, there are different stages to editing. There's like a really wide edit, there's like a wider edit, then there's a slightly wider edit, and then you just like Amber said, you keep like cutting it down. And I'm actually working on an edit right now, and the editor said, send me a wide edit, and I was like, what does that mean? Like, you know, I've been working on this for a month or so. They're like, oh, I look at hundreds a day. So I'm like, okay, so hundreds, like 20, 100, 200, like it matters. And so I'm kind of like blindly going into like sending like probably 200 photos as a wide edit, because I didn't really get an answer to my question to begin with, which is fine with me. And then the editor can kind of go through those 200s and make his edit, which I'm totally like okay with. You know, I don't really care. I'm not overly precious about my images. So I'm okay with like giving that off to an editor to like go through like a really wide edit. But yeah, again, I don't know if that answered anything at all, other than to say like it depends, and depends who you're working for and the story that you're working on.
Yeah, totally. I think we've all had that experience at some point or another. I think that covers most of the questions. I mean, I'm sure we could all talk about this stuff for hours and hours, but we're getting pretty close to our time. Do any of you have any sort of final thoughts? Maybe we can sort of come back around like we had planned to, like take a stab at like a nice tight definition of solutions photojournalism, if anybody wants to be brave enough to go for that. Or any other parting thought that you want to leave folks with.
I can try. I would say that solutions journalism, visual solutions journalism, is any expansive collection of, maybe expansive isn't the right word. I would say more of an inclusive set of photographs that attempts to capture both the problem and a possible solution, with an openness to complexity, nuance, culpability, and accountability throughout the process.
I like it.
I like that. I hope someone wrote that down. Kriston, any other parting thoughts or things to leave on?
Yeah, I think something we were talking about earlier is that the idea of when to kind of start looking at solution story, right? Especially from a visual perspective, if you want to understand how it's working, you might not find out that it's working right away. And I think that's okay, right? If we're looking at the scientific process, it's the idea of being analytical and experiencing that. And it's okay to not be afraid of failure, because I do think there's value in learning from that, as long as we're providing that additional context and, as Amber said, nuance as well in how we frame it.
Awesome. Super valid point, and something that I'd hope we would eventually get to in this. So thanks for raising that element for sure. Pat?
Yeah, I think like a lot of the times there isn't a solution, and that's, you know, the reality is, it's, you know, it's not black and white, and we're not going to get to an end of an issue or a question. But I think our job is to kind of identify what the questions are and photograph that. And that will help kind of like bring people to their own conclusions or ideas or ways that, how can we get to a solution rather than like going straight to finding the solution is kind of a good way to go about your work. And it'll make your work inherently just more interesting, more nuanced. And you'll meet people with a variety of like opinions and perspectives, and that's what we want in storytelling, right? So yeah, that would be my final thoughts on that.
Amazing. Amber, was that a hand? Do you have a response? Okay. Yeah, again, like I'm sure we could all talk for hours and hours about all of this, but I really wanted to thank the three of you for carving out some time to do this and for being flexible with the scheduling of everything. This has been a great conversation. I love talking about this stuff, and I'm glad that we've been able to help, you know, maybe make a little space to talk about this. So thank you all so much for being part of it.
Yeah. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Kim, back to you.
Yes, just a quick thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be sending a recording out as well as some resources to learn even more about solutions photojournalism. And a big thank you to our moderator. This was an amazing panel. I think we all learned so much, and we're so thankful to have you guys here and share your experience with us. So thank you everyone for coming, and have a great day. We'll see you later.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.